This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. On today's show, a Columbia University expert on the Middle East says if Romney had won the election, it would have meant a green light for war on Iran. Now, he says, sanctions will have a chance to work. Author and think tank scholar Phil Longman has an idea. Give every American at birth a federal savings account that the parents and the child would contribute to for a lifetime. And a special feature this week, with everyone talking about the Lincoln movie, Washington consultant and presidential historian Leon Billings reviews the best presidential libraries, and he recommends a stop in Springfield, Illinois. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Richard Bulliet is a Columbia University professor and an expert on the Middle East. He says Obama's re-election is promising in terms of containing Iran's nuclear ambitions, as opposed to the green light for war that would have resulted from Romney winning the election. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, Richard W. Bulliet is a professor of history at Columbia University who specializes in the history of Islamic society and institutions. A prolific author of books about Islam, Professor Bulliet has also edited books of more general interest, including The Columbia History of the 20th Century and the Encyclopedia of the Modern Middle East, and is the author of 5 novels. Professor Bulliet, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's a pleasure to speak with you. And in fact, we spoke with you earlier this year, and I wonder if, in your opinion, the re-election of President Obama will change anything regarding relations with Iran.
I think that the relation with Iran is clearly a central foreign policy issue for the Obama administration, and I think that there's a chance of it breaking open in the coming year, both because of the re-election of Obama and because in next summer, Mr. Ahmadinejad will leave the presidency in Iran, and that should offer a new array of people to talk to. So I'm optimistic that we can start talking to Iran instead of just wringing our hands.
Are there talks now of who would be a successor to Ahmadinejad? And that gives you promise to think, gosh, maybe we can head this in the right direction?
The person most often talked about is the mayor of Tehran, Mr. Ghalibaf. But I think it's less a question of the ideological outlook of whoever succeeds Ahmadinejad. It's almost certain to be someone more or less on the same conservative side, but someone who does not have a vocal track record of saying things that are inflammatory and deliberately, provocative. And I think that any successor to Ahmadinejad is likely to be much more controlled in his verbal forays into diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. Would it have mattered if the other guy won the election?
Yeah, that's Mr. Greenlight.
Yeah.
You would have had a green light for a war on Iran. Whether that war would have come in the first 6 months or in the first year, it would be hard to say. But the assumption, I think, on the part of the Israeli political establishment was that if Romney had gotten in, then Israel would have a much freer hand in choosing the time and the circumstances for making an attack on Iran.
It would have been a done deal, in your opinion, then?
I think that it would have been a done deal at some point down the line. On the other hand, when Bush was leaving office, there were people who said, Bush will get the job done before he leaves office. Now, the fact that Obama came in under great pressure to do something about Iran and chose to follow the sanctions route instead of the military route and has maintained that stance for 4 years, I think is extremely promising with respect to the coming 4 years. And I think that the Israelis now have to accept the fact that an Obama administration is not going to give them a green light on Iran for a military attack.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Professor Richard Bulliet. He's a professor of history at Columbia University. Is a nuclear-capable Iran a real threat to the United States or to the Middle East? I mean, does it depend solely on whether it is for peaceful purposes?
Well, of course, every potential nuclear threat is meaningless if only peaceful purposes are intended.
Sure.
That's sort of tautological. But a nuclear-armed Iran, given the level of armament that is theoretically conceivable, say, in the next 15 years, is no significant threat to the United States at all and in United States territories, at least not a direct threat. There is always the conceivable passing on of weapons to non-state actors, but most of those non-state actors that have shown pronounced hostility to the United States are Sunnis rather than Shiites. And it's unimaginable that a Shiite government in Iran would hand over a nuclear weapon to Al-Qaeda or other Sunni organizations because they are anti-Shiite. So I don't think there's a threat to the United States in the offing. As far as a threat to other parts of the Middle East, I think that that a nuclear-capable Iran would be assumed to have a higher profile and more importance. But in terms of an actual use strategy for the weapons, I don't think there is one. And so I don't think that the likelihood of actually using nuclear weapons is very significant in the foreseeable future.
Do you have a sense of just how close Iran is to actually having nuclear weapons? There's always been this kind of debate as to whether or not they're that close, and I wonder, from your experiences and studies, if you have any idea.
For the last 15 plus years, you have had some people saying that Iran is within 1 year of having nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is, Iran has not indicated that they have taken a decision to go for nuclear weapons. If and when that decision is taken, which I hope it is not, then you would have the question of how long it would take first to assemble a nuclear device based on highly purified uranium, and then secondly to mount that device on a reliable, missile or or other delivery system. Mm-hmm. I think the delivery system is a real headache. You have to basically miniaturize your basic weapon and fit it into a warhead, and then there's a question of testing it. And it's unimaginable to me that any country in the world anywhere would risk starting a war with untested weapons. I mean, supposing Iran did launch a missile with a nuclear warhead at someone and it didn't go off. They now are guilty of starting a nuclear war without any of the destructive product that's assumed of such a war. Mm-hmm. And I think the real test here is not so much can Iran do it in some specific time span, but can it test and develop and deploy a reliable delivery system. And it seems to me that there you're talking about a 5 to 10 year time span, not a 6 to 12 month time span.
Yeah. How can anyone be sure of what a nuclear country is up to if an authoritarian regime refuses inspections? That was very difficult for me to say, obviously, but
yeah.
Go ahead.
You have inspections in Iran. The International Atomic Energy Group has video cameras in place. They have detectors for radiation. They make visits. The question is whether they can visit anywhere they want, anytime they want, under any pretext that they might have in mind. And there are limitations. They have to go to declared sites. But those sites include the sites where Iran is generating enriched uranium that's needed for bombs, and those inspections do not, as yet, indicate a movement toward a weaponization program. If you had a preliminary an attack on Iran that, let us say, set back Iran's nuclear program for some incalculable period of time, one thing that is certain is that all those inspection devices will be turned off. Iran would not allow any further inspections as they tried to rebuild their program. So, in fact, you have an inspection regime right now.
We're speaking with Richard Bulliet, professor of history at Columbia University, who specializes in the history of Islamic society and institutions. So, Professor, how will the U.S. election affect the internal politics of Israel and Iran, for that matter?
I think that in the Israeli case, where you have an election coming up in just 3 months or so, that you now have a very uncertain situation in which, despite the fact that Mr. Netanyahu has a very strong popular majority, that popular majority may not support every one of the policies that he has espoused, particularly on the Iran side of things. And I think that Israel has to operate under the assumption that if they initiate actions against Iran, that the U.S. has its back. And I'm just not sure that with a second-term Obama administration that is not dependent upon going to the electorate again, I'm not sure that Israel can count on the U.S. Backstopping a unilateral attack on Iran. As far as the Iranian politics goes, I don't think that the American election plays a very significant role there. Iran's, except indirectly, the sanctions on Iran that have disrupted the Iranian economy have led Iranians to have a very strong and really absorbing interest in the internal domestic economic problems. And as long as those sanctions are there, with the U.S. Orchestrating the sanctions, then the U.S. is involved. But in that case, it really doesn't make much difference which president it is, because the Iranians are going to be voting more on domestic issues than on foreign issues.
In a poll before the U.S. election, a survey of Israeli voters showed massive support for Romney. Is that something that should be of concern to Americans? I mean, are U.S. and Israeli politics too intertwined for each other's good?
I don't think that the popular support that an American candidate or sitting president has in a foreign country should be of any concern to us at all. If the Israelis wanted Romney, well, they didn't get Romney. Now they have to live with that. And whether they live with that comfortably or whether it causes disruptions is not fundamentally an American problem. It's an Israeli problem. The interconnection between American and Israeli politics is largely operates through the Congress, where you have a very strong bipartisan support in both houses for Israel. But there are very few things that really have to come up at a congressional level, particularly in a second term, where the question of a president trying to make sure that he can get reelected is no longer an issue. So I think that the Israelis may not like having Obama be president for 4 more years. They have to live with that. Just as Republicans in this country have to live with the fact that they are not going to have Romney, that they're going to have Obama for 4 more years. And I don't think this intertwining is of crucial concern for Americans.
Okay. Richard W. Bulliet, professor of history at Columbia University, specializing in the history of Islamic society and institutions. Professor, as always, thank you so much for your time today on AmericasDemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Well, you're quite welcome. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Phil Longman is a progressive thinker, and he has a program he believes would preserve the middle class for generations. A lifetime savings account funded by the government to start and built by obligatory contributions from the holder's salary. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Joining us now, Philip Longman, a senior research fellow with the New America Foundation's Health Policy Program, where he currently concentrates on delivery system reform. He is also a senior fellow at the Washington Monthly, formerly a senior writer and deputy assistant managing editor at U.S. News and World Report. He has won numerous awards for his business and financial writing. Philip Longman, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, you recently wrote that whether Democrats succeed in stimulating the economy or Republicans succeed in cutting taxes, it won't matter. Why not? What are we missing?
Well, it'll matter, but the point I was trying to make is that even if we were to get the unemployment rate back to where it was in 2007, that the great mass of America would still be hurting because we were hurting back then. So we need to create more jobs, but we also need to look at more fundamental things that were eroding the wealth of the middle class and eroding the upward mobility of young people before this Great Recession.
One of the big issues facing Americans is that baby boomers as a group don't have enough savings or pensions to live comfortably in old age. How serious an issue is this at a time when people are talking about ending Medicare as we know it?
Well, it's very serious, and I think something we'll be talking about endlessly for the next 10 to 20 years, which is that the elderly are going to be the most rapidly growing poverty group in America if we don't do something real serious real soon. Frankly, it's too late for many of us baby boomers, but at least we can take some measures to help the next generations not make the same mistakes we did.
Mm-hmm. Is it really true that young Americans today are behind where their parents were in terms of realizing that American dream?
Well, of course, a generation's a big thing, but for the vast majority of young people today, they are very much encumbered with debt, for example, at levels that previous generations never had to endure. So, the average student coming out of college now with student loans has about $25,000 in debt. And I think for the class of 2011 now, more than half of them are either unemployed or working in jobs that don't require a college degree. We also have studies showing that the avenues to upward mobility are much less than they were in the past, much less than they are even in supposedly class-bound Europe today. So by many measures, we're seeing massive downward mobility among today's young people, millennials, and Gen Xers, and boomers too.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Philip Longman, Senior Research Fellow with the New America Foundation's Health Policy Program, formerly a senior writer and deputy assistant managing editor at U.S. News, World and Report. Are these bleak observations primarily the result of conservative economic policies?
Yes, in a word.
All right, and I guess we go to the next question now. No. We'll let you expand on that.
All right. I mean, it's a combination of some things that had to be done because of the aging of the population and changes in technology and other things. Democrats, many of them went along with some of these changes back in the 1980s and 90s. and unfortunately, they were poorly executed. I'm thinking in particular of this massive change, really on the order of the New Deal that we made in the 1980s about how each generation was going to provide for its old age. So in the 1980s, with bipartisan support, we created this system of 401ks and individual retirement accounts and dramatically cut back Social Security for future generations at that time. These were things that some of them needed to be done, but unfortunately we didn't mandate that people save for their retirement, and also at the same time we were telling people that they now had to trust their retirement savings to the sharks on Wall Street. We were telling the sharks on Wall Street that there are no more rules. So both parties are complicit. I would say, on balance, conservative ideas poorly executed have brought us to this point more than anything else.
Now, I get the feeling that current conservative ideology would only perpetuate this problem. Are there things that can be done now that can offer at least some level of a quick reversal to some of these things and maybe right the ship, if you will?
Quick reversal is pretty difficult, but to begin with, today's younger generation, yes, there's many things that we can do. In this special issue of the Washington Monthly, I float a plan for what I'm calling American Stakeholder Account. Essentially, the idea is that every child, when they're born today, already gets a Social Security number. Going forward, they would also get a savings account into which their parents or grandparents could contribute some money. For low-income children, we'd have the government start some money. And then throughout life, we would have a mandatory savings program that might require you to commit, say, 4% of your income going forward. If it's mandatory, then we don't wind up with the great problem that we have today, where close to a majority of baby boomers really have no retirement savings at all. Human nature is what it is, and people need help and prodding and nudging to do the right thing when it comes to their Social Security or security in old age. So that's a plan going forward that would help a lot. We also have to make a lot of progress on the whole debt side of the average American's balance sheet, because it's hard to believe, but throughout human history, going back to the Code of Hammurabi in ancient Mesopotamia, every civilization has always had laws against usury, the charging of outrageous interest rates on loans and debts. And that was true, for the Pilgrims. It was true all through American history up until the 1970s, when, again, both parties conspired to just bring us a world in which there was no regulation of debt. And so we've had this, in the last generation, explosion of predatory lending in credit cards and mortgages and student loans across the board. And that it has to be a very high priority, because so much of what is the problem today for boomers and the next generation of elders is not just that they didn't save enough, but they got into really bad loans. It's not that they spent so much more money on themselves, despite stereotypes. The statistics show that, baby boomers were not particularly spendthrift in the sense of buying all kinds of luxury products. But when you come into this world encumbered with student loans and credit card contracts that have all these hidden fees and mortgages that explode on you, it's the makings of the undoing of the American middle class and reversal of all the progress we've made for the security of the elderly in American society.
We're speaking with Philip Longman, senior fellow at the Washington Monthly. You make the point that popular tax policies that help create wealth only create it for the rich, the people who can afford to have IRAs or homes to deduct interest on. Do you really think there's a chance that those tax breaks will be repealed? I mean, there's some awfully popular breaks for people across, whatever,
right.
Republicans, Democrats, third party, whatever. I mean, a lot of people take advantage of those and want those to stay.
Well, I mean, just to begin with some background, the United States today spends about $500 billion a year in a bundle of different policies that are designed to help people acquire assets and build their assets. These include everything from the preferential treatment of capital gains to the home mortgage deduction. But these policies are really Robin Hood in reverse. 80% of the benefit of these programs goes to the 20% richest people in America, who are, of course, the people who need the least help in becoming wealthier yet. And yet that basically is our asset building policy. Now, normally you'd be right, I think, in saying that it's politically impossible to take on these entrenched interests that benefit from these various tax loopholes, except that I think all political observers are agreed that early next year we're going to have a gigantic national discussion and debate in Congress about reforming the tax code as a way of building, first of all, closing these long-term deficits, and also of building some more equity and fairness into the tax system. So it's going to be on the table. A lot of very powerful interest groups, from everybody in the military-industrial establishment to everybody who collects Social Security to road builders. Everybody is vulnerable here to major overhaul of federal spending. And while we're having this conversation, why not bring into the mix that we should reform this $1 trillion that we're spending on helping rich people get richer, to readjust those policies so that they help people with modest and low incomes to rise up in American society. Oddly, this whole agenda is something that actually has quite a bit of appeal to conservative-minded people who, are focused on the importance of individual responsibility and of paying your own way and of not becoming dependent on government. And I think we've seen a lot of support from Republicans even for policies like the one I described that would mandate individual savings from birth.
Can we expect to see some change then?
Well, I think so. I think it's quite an amazing moment. But just to give you an example, Rick Santorum, the former senator from Pennsylvania, who's perhaps one of the most conservative Republicans running in this year's presidential election, spent the last 3 or 4 years co-signing with Democrats to create a savings program like the one I just described. In the current hyper-partisan atmosphere, you won't hear Rick Santorum saying that this moment, but it is something that has something for both liberals and conservatives to like about it. So, and obviously the status quo is not going to hold that much longer. With these levels of unemployment and this level of hurt among both young people and old people, we are at the brink where something really does have to give.
And Philip Longman, Senior Research Fellow with the New America Foundation's Health Policy Program, concentrating on delivery system reform, also Senior Fellow at the Washington Monthly. Philip, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Take a tour of presidential libraries with longtime Washington policy maven Leon Billings, who tells us his favorite repositories of White House history. But right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Politics brings out people's best and worst, and the deeply weird. For example, The 2012 prize for stupidest things said about women was in the bag for those two GOP Senate candidates who flashed voters with gross displays of their masculine boorishness and ignorance on the topic of rape. But then, out of far-right field came Janice Lane to snatch the prize from the men. President of the Central Mississippi Tea Party, Ms. Lane blurted to a reporter that the worst change in American politics was letting women vote. There is nothing worse than a bunch of mean, hateful women, she explained. They are diabolical, double-minded. You can never trust them. Janice added that she always preferred to have a male boss. Speaking of which, take Donnie Trump, please. On election night, he surpassed his own world record in the egomaniacal high jump by sending tweets complaining that Obama was being declared president even though he had lost the popular vote. "Revolution," tweeted the twit. "Let's fight like hell and stop this great and disgusting injustice." Only, Obama had won the popular vote, leaving the penthouse revolutionary looking even more ridiculous than usual. Maybe Holly Solomon has the only effective solution for shutting down the Donald's irritating ego explosions. A Romney backer from suburban Phoenix, she was not only distraught that Obama had been reelected, but also infuriated that her hubby, Daniel, had failed to vote, as though he had personally caused Romney's loss. Finally, her fury erupted in a parking lot where he had gotten out of the car as she was yelling at him for his civic inadequacy. Fury turned into bedlam, for Holly chased him in the car, still yelling, and ran him down, leaving poor Daniel pinned under the vehicle in critical condition. This is Jim Hightower saying, be careful, it's weird out there.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Washington consultant Leon Billings recently took a vacation, touring presidential libraries and museums. He talks about his favorites and finds that the Lincoln Library is ideal for children and Clinton's the most educational. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Leon G. Billings is president of the consulting firm that bears his name and that designs public policy strategies on issues pending before Congress. He also advises clients on political matters and a broad range of environmental, energy, health, and safety legislation. As a chief aide to the late Senator Edmund Muskie, Mr. Billings helped write the landmark Clean Air and Clean Water Acts of the 1970s. Leon Billings, thanks very much for joining us on americasdemocrats.org.
It's nice to be with you today.
You recently took an interesting tour of the United States, and I've been dying to talk to you about this, too, because I just think this is so interesting. Some people try to visit, every baseball stadium, but you took a tour of presidential museums and homes. What made you want to do it, and what did you learn?
Well, what made me want to do it was I was a history major in college, and I've been reading biography for decades, and because I think knowing who the people were that make history tells you what history is all about. And so my wife and I decided that we would just take this 6,000-mile trip and visit, I think it was 8 or 9 presidential homes, museums, and libraries.
So what did you take away from? What kind of things did you learn? Things that obviously you were a history major, but did you learn things that you didn't know otherwise?
I learned a lot. I mean, it's amazing. You think you know something, and you find out how little you know. The more you learn, the less well educated you are. I think the most fascinating thing to me was the role of wealth in determining our political leaders. I was aware of the fact that Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk, for example, were men of landed wealth. They owned slaves. They had large plantations. But I didn't have any idea how much wealth they had and how deeply they were involved in land speculation, which gave them great fortunes. And then you go to the Truman Library, and you go to the Eisenhower Library, and you go to the Clinton Library, and you realize that those people didn't come from any wealth. They came from being in part in the right place at the right time, being in part genuine political leaders, and being, I guess, in part lucky. And so you have this dichotomy in America. Herbert Hoover was self-described, if you go to his library, self-described as fabulously wealthy. Well, I don't think anybody thinks of Herbert Hoover as being a, quote, fabulously wealthy man. But there it is, right out there in front of you. And so there's, you get a feeling for some of the elements that made greatness possible for some of these people, and then you wonder why a kid who was so poor that he couldn't go to school for a while in Texas, Lyndon Johnson, ever made it to where he was. I mean, it's a fascinating history of America, and it tells you so much about where we come from and who we are.
Which library or historical site would you say is your favorite after this trip?
Well, that's a hard choice. When I started thinking about this some years ago, I had always wanted to go to the Truman Library. I had met Truman when he was campaigning for Stevenson in '56, and I've got a great picture of me and Harry on the wall of my office. And I really wanted to know more about the man. And his library and museum are as plain and direct and uncomplicated as Harry Truman himself. And so you get more of a picture of a real person in a very brief time at Truman than, say, you do at some of the other libraries where there's just so much to try to absorb.
Wow. We're speaking with Leon Billings, president of Leon G. Billings, LLC, consulting firm that designs public policy strategies on issues pending before Congress, and talking about this really interesting tour of the United States that Mr. Billings and his wife took. If someone with only, say, a casual interest in history could visit only one site, which would you recommend of what you saw?
Well, I think bear in mind that I've been to about 20 of these things total, so this isn't my first trip. But I've just done the other ones one at a time, not 8.5 like I did this time. Mm-hmm. I think the one that's far and away the most educational would be the Clinton Library, which is magnificently done. It's very educational. You can spend hours just using the videos. It's a very high-tech place. So for this generation who learn by listening and watching rather than reading, the Clinton Library is probably the best. The best one for children, far and away, is the Lincoln Library that the state of Illinois has done in Springfield. It's got very modern technology, but it's a very family-oriented, it's less detailed, but much more informative about Lincoln.
When you go around to the different libraries and presidential libraries and museums, and you had mentioned earlier that you learned a lot that you thought you knew and you ended up you didn't. Is there just so much more than what you're going to get in a history book if you're a student coming up? When you get that you can learn about the individuals and about the families and how they got to where they are or were?
Well, I think what you get is enough information to give you an idea of what you would like to know more about. Because I still think that what the written word, whether you read it or listen to it on audio tapes, is a much more comprehensive way to learn about these people. But when you when you look at the pieces of history that are laid out in these museums, you say, gee, I'd like to know more about that. And then you begin fishing to find what's the best place to go to fill in the blanks. So, I mean, these are like fish ponds, you know. They may be artificially stocked, but once you catch fish in them, then you want to go find where the real creeks are and where the real fish are, and that's what's good about them.
Now, as a lifelong Democrat, are there any Republican historical shrines you found valuable or of interest to the casual tourist?
Actually, the Hoover Museum, which is in West Branch, Iowa, which you would hardly notice on the map, was very insightful, in part because of the museums that we visited. He was the one who I probably had the least personal historical information on. We studied Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, and I read a lot about them. But I hadn't read a lot about Hoover. But I was completely unaware of the scope of humanitarianism that Hoover was engaged in his lifetime. I mean, he really was quite a remarkable human being. I think he made some major mistakes. But then I got the insight of that. You know, he came into office in March of 1929, and the market crashed in October of 29, and perhaps through the fault of his party, but not through his own fault. And not greatly unlike Obama, who inherited a mess. Mm-hmm. So you look at Hoover, and you look at what he was confronted with, and you look what he tried to do, and you can see his victories and his failures. But it was a very educational visit for me as a Democrat.
We're speaking with Leon Billings, president of the Leon G. Billings consulting firm, designs public policy strategies on issues pending before Congress. You may also recall that as a chief aide, Mr. Billings, to the late Senator Edmund Muskie, Mr. Billings helped write the landmark Clean Air and Clean Water Acts of the 1970s, and we're talking about an interesting trip that he took recently touring some presidential museums and homes. Could you talk a little bit about some of the larger insights you've gained from visiting these presidential historical sites? For instance, are we at a point in history where the presidency has shrunk in power and the highly partisan majorities in Congress will rule the day?
We certainly are at a point in history where the divisions in Congress could have a significantly adverse effect on the future of our country. We have a chief executive who has a significant range of broad powers in foreign policy and in domestic policy, but seriously restricted in his ability to affect economic policy without the help of Congress. And you see that in these libraries. You see the confrontations in the Jefferson Jackson Polk era. It was confrontation over the expansion of the United States, and that was involved in the expansion of slavery in the United States, which eventually led to the Civil War. But you had virtual gridlock. You had the same kind of divisions in the 1840s and 1850s that you had during the run-up to the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and 65. So there's that old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Mm-hmm. And you see a great deal of that. But, eventually people have risen. I mean, you look at Lyndon Johnson, who wasn't a very nice man, and who was probably the single most effective president from a legislative perspective, and from extending the social programs in this country to the greatest number of people in American history, greater than Roosevelt, greater than Truman, greater than Kennedy. But But, how did this guy who got there by accident manage to do all that? Well, he did it because he was a masterful technician and tactician. So, those things happen in America, and I think we go through these cycles, and we eventually get to a point where things happen, like they did with Ed Muskie and the environmental laws in the 70s. We built coalitions, and we got things done that were truly radical, but we got them done with unanimity. Mm-hmm. So it happens.
Do you think we'll get that back?
Yes. I refuse to be pessimistic. I believe that in times of storm and stress, greatness arises. And I think you will see, we will go through this period where this Tea Party type revolt disappears and gets becomes a burden too great for the GOP, and the GOP is going to have to decide, are they going to survive or are they going to die? And when they make the decision that they want to survive, then you're going to see a change.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Leon Billings, president of Leon G. Billings, LLC, consulting firm that designs public policy strategies on issues pending before Congress, also advises clients on political matters and a broad range of environmental, energy, health, and safety legislation. Leon, as always, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you, Jim. It's been fun.
This is great. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Richard Bulliet, Phil Longman, and Leon Billings. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to America.